The date is January 1945. Snow drifts across the tracks as a freight train painted in army olive rumbles westward through the frozen plains of the American Midwest. Inside the cars sit hundreds of German prisoners of war, silent, cold, and bewildered. They peer through fogged glass at the passing landscape, towering grain silos, endless lines of locomotives and freight yards that seem to stretch forever. Every siding is filled, oil tankers, coal cars, flatbeds carrying jeeps wrapped in canvas. And yet everything moves in rhythm, every whistle, every stem, signal light, every engine perfectly timed. One officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, mutters under his breath, "In Germany we barely have trains running anymore." An American MP nearby glances up, hearing the man's broken English, but says nothing. He simply checks his clipboard, a long list of train numbers, car types, and scheduled stops, and moves on with quiet efficiency. To the prisoners, it's both ordinary and incomprehensible. This is no propaganda tour, this is just how America moves. The clack of wheels over rail joints becomes hypnotic. Some of the men think of the chaos back home, bombed depots, twisted tracks, locomotives stranded for lack of fuel. Here, by contrast, there is order, power, and abundance. They had imagined America as a land of luxury and distance. What they are seeing now is something far more formidable. A nation that has turned its trains into the arteries of a global army. Because by 1945, the American railroad wasn't just a mode of transport. It was a weapon. And for these captured soldiers, this quiet, rolling journey would reveal something Germany never truly understood, that America's strength lay not only in its factories or armies, but in the way it moved. To understand what those German soldiers witnessed from their train windows, we need to rewind to December 1941, the moment America entered the war. In the days after Pearl Harbor, the United States found itself in a crisis of movement. Millions of men would have to be transported, trained, and supplied. Entire divisions would cross from one coast to the other. Tanks, artillery, aircraft engines, and food all had to be delivered not only across America's vast distances, but across oceans. Air transport was still in its infancy. Roads could not handle the weight of war. The only answer lay in steel, the railroads. Within weeks, America's rail companies, from the Pennsylvania to the Southern Pacific, were absorbed into a single coordinated system under the Office of Defense Transportation led by Joseph B. Eastman. A soft-spoken man in round spectacles, Eastman would become the quiet architect of wartime mobility. He summoned executives from every major railroad to Washington, handed them the Army's demands, and told them bluntly, "We must run this country as one system or we will lose." By 1942, the transformation was complete. Passenger trains were converted to troop carriers, freight cars were reconfigured for tanks and aircraft parts, and timetables were rewritten with military precision. Civilian travel was slashed by nearly half. Every available locomotive, every yard, every piece of track now served the war. Each day over 200,000 freight cars rolled out of American yards, carrying weapons, ammunition, and supplies. In the span of a week, the U.S. Army could move an entire division, men, tanks, trucks, and all, from Texas to New Jersey. To the Germans, whose own trains were crippled by bombing and bureaucracy, this level of coordination was unthinkable. Under Hitler's rule, logistics was fractured by rivalry. The Army, the Luftwaffe, and the SS all ran separate systems, competing for fuel and track time. One depot might have too many shells, another none at all. In America, it was the opposite. A private railway president could receive a direct call from Washington and divert an entire line within minutes. The nation had become a single synchronized organism of motion. When those German POWs later rolled through Illinois or Kansas, they were staring at the end product of this invisible revolution. Not chaos, not chance, but the deliberate rhythm of an industrial empire at war. Every turn of the wheel, every puff of steam, was part of a grand choreography. But the prisoners didn't yet realize that the trains they rode were carrying more than men. They were carrying a message about the scale, discipline, and ingenuity of a country whose power they had gravely underestimated. By 1944, The war had turned decisively against Germany. American forces were advancing across Europe, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. The United States suddenly faced a problem no one had planned: for what to do with so many captured soldiers. The solution was astonishing in both scale and simplicity: bring them to America. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war were shipped across the Atlantic, packed aboard Liberty ships, bound for ports like Boston, New Orleans, and New York. Once on U.S. soil, they were placed onto trains, endless convoys of olive-drab railcars, bound for camps scattered across the interior. The logic was strategic. America's vast size made escape almost impossible. And deep inside, the heartland POWs could be safely employed as farmhands, lumber workers, and mechanics, freeing American labor for the front. The German soldiers in these convoys came from every corner of the Wehrmacht: Afrika Korps veterans, Luftwaffe ground crews, even sailors from sunken U-boats. For many, it was their first glimpse of the enemy's homeland, a journey through an America few civilians ever saw. They were loaded onto troop trains under military guard, each car sealed and watched by MPs. Some trains ran for days without stopping, pausing only to refuel or swap engines. Yet even these moments amazed the Germans. At every junction they saw railway workers in clean uniforms, signals changing in perfect sequence, locomotives waiting in precise formation. There was no shouting, no confusion, no shortages. When their own trains had moved across France or Poland, it had often been chaos: men scrambling for orders, track crews, exhausted lines bombed or broken. Here, everything was effortless. At scheduled meal stops, American cooks distributed hot coffee and food to both guards and prisoners. Sometimes the soldiers were allowed to step out, stretch, and breathe in the cold Midwestern air. The towns were quiet, the depots alive with motion. Locals would stare as the POW trains rolled by, some in pity, others in curiosity. In diaries later recovered after the war, German officers wrote of their shock. One recalled, "Everywhere we looked we saw abundance. Not just food, but fuel, trains, machines. We could not understand how a single nation could have so much." For these men, the train journey became a revelation. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was lazy, decadent, soft. Yet what they witnessed was discipline on a scale. They had never imagined a nation where every worker seemed to know his role. Every system worked, every line moved on time. And this was only one piece of the puzzle. Because the rail network they saw was not the cause of American power, it was the symptom. Something far larger was feeding. Those endless trains. Something that turned America itself into one vast, humming machine of production. When the German prisoners watched those US trains thunder by, they saw the surface of something much deeper, the living veins of an MLIFers, industrial organism whose heartbeats were the factories of America. From Detroit to Pittsburgh, from Buffalo to Chicago, the war had transformed the nation's industrial landscape into one continuous assembly line. America had done something no other nation could match. It connected its production lines directly to its railways, creating an uninterrupted flow from factory floor to front line. In 1942, Detroit stopped building cars and began building tanks. Pittsburgh's steel mills never cooled Chicago's. Machine shops churned out engines, munitions, and landing craft around the clock. The entire economy had become an engine of war, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every product had a destination, and every destination had a train. A Sherman tank might roll off a Michigan assembly line in the morning, be loaded onto a flat car by evening, and be bound for a port on the East Coast before the next sunrise. Army clerks tracked its movement through punched cards and ledgers. Each shipment logged with military precision. No idle days, no lost cargo, no mystery. It was not just speed, it was coordination. Factories, ports, and depots were bound by radio, telegraph, and telephone. Dispatchers could redirect shipments in 30 minutes. Trains full of engines, ammunition, or rations were switched between lines seamlessly, as if the entire country shared a single brain. To the Germans, who had lived under constant air raids, This was unimaginable. Their own rail yards were in ruins, their factories reduced to rubble. Allied bombers had shredded the Reich's arteries, cutting fuel lines, crippling deliveries, and trapping tanks without engines. Even before the front collapsed, Germany's logistical heart had stopped beating. Captured German engineers shown photographs of American rail yards admitted their disbelief. "We built machines," one said. "They built a system. That system, invisible, tireless, perfectly synchronized, was what made the difference between attrition and annihilation." An American general once described it bluntly. Logistics wins wars. Battles only prove it. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis nations combined. The trains those German POWs rode in were just the surface expression of that. Miracle mobile arteries carrying the pulse of a continent, and the irony was impossible to ignore. The prisoners had once mocked American industry as soulless, mechanical, impersonal. Now they saw that very impersonality as its genius. Because the US war machine, it didn't depend on one man's will or one ideology's fury. It ran on systems, workers, and motion. And soon those same systems would roll across the seas, proving that America's efficiency didn't stop at its borders. By the summer of 1944, the same logistical genius that had moved America's armies across its own land was now unleashed across Europe. The beaches of Normandy had been secured, the breakout from Saint-Lô achieved, and the Allied armies were racing east toward Paris and beyond. But success created a new problem: speed. The front was moving faster than the supply lines could follow. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every meal for millions of men had to travel hundreds of miles over terrain. Shattered by retreating Germans, railways were wrecked, bridges blown, roads cratered. So the Americans did what they always did. They improvised a system that no one else could. It was called the Red Ball Express. In August of 1944, thousands of trucks, mostly GMC, and Studebaker tuna-half-ton haulers were organized into a continuous relay between the ports of Normandy and the front lines. The name came from railroad slang. Red Ball meant priority freight that moved without delay. For weeks on end, the convoys never stopped. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers from segregated units, ran day and night, guided by red circular signs, along hastily marked roads. The trucks became a rolling pipeline, one that fed Patton's tanks, Eisenhower's armies, and the entire momentum of the Western Front: fuel in jerry cans, rations in boxes, shells in crates, everything moved in rhythm. When one truck broke down, another rolled forward instantly. Mechanics repaired engines on the roadside under lantern light. MPs directed convoys through the dark, often under the threat of air attack. German prisoners captured in the aftermath could only stare at the endless columns of vehicles. One officer wrote after the war, "We had destroyed the French railways and thought the Allies would choke on their own speed. Instead, they grew faster. It was a miracle of motion. That miracle had its roots in what the German POWs back in America had already seen: a nation where logistics was not chaos, but choreography. Every gallon of fuel that reached the front could trace its lineage through a ledger, a warehouse, a train, and a worker, thousands of miles away. The Red Ball Express proved that America's strength wasn't just in production, it was in connection. A tank built in Detroit, a shell forged in Pennsylvania, and a loaf of bread baked in Kansas could all find their way to the same battlefield at the same hour, and behind every soldier, every truck, every convoy, was the same invisible rhythm, a rhythm those POWs had first heard in the steady clatter of train wheels over Midwestern rails. The Germans had believed the Reich unbeatable through willpower. The Americans proved victory came from organization. But the lesson wasn't over yet, because for those prisoners staring out trains windows across the US, the most extraordinary thing wasn't the machinery, it was the people behind it. The train carrying German prisoners rolled smoothly through the night, its wheels hammering a steady rhythm that echoed in the prison minds. For many of them, men who had once marched under banners promising a 1,000-year Reich, the sheer calmness of the American system was unnerving. There were no barking officers, no shouted orders, no threats of punishment. And yet, everything happened exactly as planned. At every junction they saw guards check schedules, wave signals, and move trains with clockwork precision. The MPs aboard didn't act like conquerors, they acted like professionals. When one prisoner asked, half in jest, how many soldiers it took to organize such movements, the American guard only smiled. Less than you'd think. Everyone just does their part. That phrase haunted them. Everyone just does their part. In Germany, logistics had always been a web of command, fear, and hierarchy. Trains didn't move unless some officer in Berlin signed a paper. Supplies vanished when bureaucrats hoarded fuel for political reasons. Rivalries between the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Luftwaffe made efficiency impossible. The Reich War machine was powerful but fragile, dependent on control. Here in America they were witnessing something alien, a decentralized, disciplined system where initiative flowed upward, not downward. From the engineer in his cab to the cook serving meals at a siding, everyone understood their role without needing to be forced. Even when a delay occurred, a track repair, a weather hold, the correction came instantly without panic or argument. At one refueling stop in Kansas, a prisoner noticed an American sergeant repairing a coupling pin with improvised tools. No officer watched him, no one gave orders, and yet within minutes the train was ready to move again. The German turned to his comrade and whispered, "If this were home, we would still be waiting for permission." Later, that night, the same prisoners saw a railway yard glowing in the darkness, lines of trains arriving and departing, all under the coordination of a single dispatcher in a glass tower. Telegraph wires hummed overhead, lights blinked, and switches clicked in a rhythm that felt alive. It wasn't just efficiency, it was culture, a quiet confidence that didn't need ceremony, a belief that systems should serve people, not the other way around. One officer later told an American interviewer, "We thought your nation was soft, but your softness is strength. You trust each other. That is something we never understood." As their train thundered onward through the Midwest, those words echoed among the prisoners. They had been trained to measure power in tanks and bombs, but here they were seeing another kind of weapon, one built on trust, coordination, and competence. They realized something that few Germans had ever grasped. A nation that could move like this, think like this, could not be defeated. And yet the heart of that power wasn't made of steel or steam, it was made of people, millions of ordinary workers forming one unbreakable human network. Every system, no matter how vast, is built on people. And what stunned the German prisoners most wasn't the number of American trains, it was the number of Americans who made them run. From the smallest switch tower to the largest yard in Chicago, men and women worked side by side to keep the rails alive. Clerks tapped out telegraphs with coded messages to dispatchers hundreds of miles away. Switchmen threw levers by hand, aligning steel paths for endless freights. Women, many in overalls and kerchiefs, managed scheduling offices and maintenance records, a wartime necessity that had turned Rosie the Riveter into Rosie the Railroader. And yet, despite the millions of moving parts, the system rarely failed. It was in many ways a reflection of democracy itself, decentralized but united by trust. German officers trained in a rigid hierarchy couldn't understand it. They had come from a nation where obedience was everything, and authority absolute. But here, they watched a different kind of discipline. Workers correcting errors without fear, junior staff making critical decisions, and foremen coordinating without shouting. It looked chaotic until you saw the results. Everything worked, everything connected. The key lay in something intangible. Responsibility. Every American worker believed they were part of something larger, a purpose that didn't require propaganda to sustain. Whether it was a teenager running telegraph cables in Missouri or a 40-year-old woman calculating rail weights in Ohio, each link of the chain trusted the next. When interviewed after the war, one German engineer recalled, "We had order through fear. They had order through confidence. That is the difference. This trust wasn't sentimental. It was practical." A yardmaster in St. Louis didn't wait for Washington to approve a reroute. He made the decision knowing the system trusted his judgment. If a bridge washed out in Arkansas, the news flashed through telegraph lines within minutes, and alternate routes were already forming by the hour. It was a living network, breathing, thinking, adapting, powered by millions of invisible hands. For the German prisoners sitting in their rail cars, it was a revelation. They had been told that democracy was weak, that without control, chaos would reign. Yet they were watching a democracy run a war with more precision than any dictatorship ever had. As their train passed through a night yard, the glow of lanterns reflected on the rails, a sea of motion signals and silent cooperation. Somewhere above them, the dispatcher's voice crackled over a radio, calm and confident. Train 409 clear on mainline westbound, keep her moving. And that was the essence of the American system. Keep her moving. Not through fear, not through command, but through trust. The German POWs would never forget it. They had seen a human network that no bomb could break, no ideology could duplicate, a machine powered not by steel and fuel but by the discipline of free people working as one. As the war drew to a close in May 1945, America's trains kept rolling, but their cargo began to change. The same locomotives that had carried soldiers to embarkation ports were now carrying them home. From the Pacific to the Atlantic, troop trains thundered across the nation. Thousands of flat cars carried the weapons of victory back to storage depots. Dining cars served millions of demobilized soldiers, their first home-cooked meals in years. Families gathered at platforms, waving flags and flowers as the iron arteries of war became the lifelines of peace. It was the largest logistical demobilization in human history, and it happened with almost no breakdowns. To the German POWs still held in camps across America, this was perhaps the most humbling revelation of all. Even after victory, the system didn't collapse. The war machine simply shifted gears. Factories that had built bombers began producing tractors. Rail yards that had dispatched tanks now shipped grain and consumer goods. The American machine didn't sleep, it adapted effortlessly. At the POW camps, many German officers were granted books, newspapers, even technical manuals to study. They began to piece together what they had seen, the vast collaboration between private industry, government, and citizens. What they once dismissed as chaotic capitalism was in fact a symphony of specialization. 1. Colonel wrote in a letter later recovered by Allied intelligence. They can move a nation without orders. We require orders to move a platoon. That is why they won. For these prisoners, the train convoys they had once seen as mere transportation had become symbols of a civilization that could mobilize not through fear but through willful cooperation. They realized with growing clarity that the real power of the United States wasn't in its bombs or tanks, it was in its motion built on trust, on planning, and on an unbreakable faith in systems that worked. When repatriation finally came, many German prisoners carried home a strange respect for their captors. They had witnessed a form of power entirely different from the Reich power that was quiet, methodical, unstoppable. In one camp diary, a former U-boat officer described standing by a siding as another American train roared past into the night. The engine light flickered briefly on his face, and he whispered to himself, "We never had a chance. Not against this." The United States had proven something history would remember, that wars are not only won by courage or technology, but by movement, and no nation moved like America. In the quiet clatter of that American train rolling through the heartland, the captured German soldiers glimpsed the soul of their enemy, not in speeches or slogans, but in motion. Through frost-covered windows, they had seen the rhythm of a nation at war with chaos itself, a place where every worker, every rail, every mile of steel served a single relentless purpose. What they witnessed wasn't luck, it was design. America's victory in the Second World War was built not only on production or bravery, but on the ability to move, to coordinate, to supply, to adapt. Where Germany centralized control and stifled initiative, the United States decentralized responsibility and multiplied efficiency. Every whistle in the night, Every signal light changing in perfect sequence was a heartbeat of that immense organism. And when those prisoners finally understood what they were seeing, the power of a free people moving in harmony, they realized that no amount of willpower or ideology could match it. The war had shown them many kinds of strength, firepower, technology, courage. But this quiet, endless motion was something else entirely, a weapon of discipline and trust. Years later, some of those former prisoners would tell their families that their first true defeat hadn't come on the battlefield. It had come on that train, somewhere between Kansas and Wisconsin, when they realized that their enemy's strength was not in destruction, but in motion. The train fades into the horizon, its whistle echoing across open fields. It is not speeding toward war anymore, but toward the future. And for those who rode it, for those who watched it pass, the lesson would last a lifetime. Because in the Second World War, victory didn't just belong to the strongest army, it belonged to the nation that could move,